Hey gang, welcome back to another video here at Joe Daddy's Garage. If you've been following along with this project, you already know what's going on with it and the difficulties that I'm having fitting pieces and parts together. If you're new to the video series, I suggest you go back to the first video on the Brooklyn Pony playlist and have a look at what's going on. Basically, I'm starting with pieces and parts left over from a rusted out 66 convertible, and I'm merging those into new panels that are mostly Dynacorn. And take a look at that and enjoy the ride. Now, this video in this particular sequence is number 5, I think, in the tranny and engine fitment process. I've run into a bunch of different problems, and I'm remedying those as I go along and trying to solve these problems. Now, the last video, I was pretty frustrated. After fighting with getting the transmission to fit into place and all that stuff that I was having to modify, and then I tried to fit the headers to the car and realized that the steering wasn't going to work with those headers. However, I have received a bunch of comments on that last video, which I'm going to try to incorporate and see if they can't resolve some of these problems. One of the comments, in particular, that stood out was the steering column can be adjusted, say, fore and aft, or in and out. So if I were to move it forward, lower into the engine bay, in effect that's going to change the pitch angle on the shaft. It would make that upper part of the shaft really kind of move away from where the headers would be. So that may give the clearance that I need for the headers. So that has yet to be investigated. Another comment was that I better fit up the sway bar and make sure that it doesn't interact with any of the components that are already on the car. So that is something else that I need to look at. As far as the transmission, I had a bunch of different ideas and comments that all make sense. Now, some of those are going to make more sense than others. And some comments were talking about changing or dropping the tail of the transmission down so you have a little more clearance for the bolts in the back. Some were putting in studs so that you could just get the transmission up and slip it on and put nuts on the studs coming out of the back of the block. Another suggestion was to remove the engine mounts and lower the assembly or lower the front of the engine and get the bolts in that way. There was another suggestion, which was modify the firewall. Now, all of these are probably great suggestions, but I have to think long term. If you're looking at the possibility that maybe one day that transmission has to come back out, well, I don't want to hand it off to somebody who's going to have to fight with it at that point. If they don't know about changing, taking out the engine mounts so that you can angle things or drop, just whatever thing they have to do to copy what I did when I put the thing together. As far as the studs go, I don't think that's going to work. And I'll go into more detail about that, but ideally, if the studs were sticking out and you had a straight shot, that would be fine. But you really don't, because you have to come up and clear the firewall while trying to get it to go over those studs, and also while you're trying to interact with the 2 guide pins that are on the side of the block. I don't think that's going to work. And I actually have made a rudimentary model, let's say, very basic drawing or pieces that represent the engine, the transmission, and the firewall. And I want to show you what I think is going to be the conflict with each one of those. So I'm going to do a little overview of the car again and talk about what's going on with it, and then I'll come back and show you my little display. So I'll go over a few things that are an issue or could be an issue depending on how I approach getting the bolts in. There's very little space here between the bottom of the oil pan and the rack and pinion setup. I know it's one thing you could do is remove the rack and pinion setup, get it out of the way, but I'm going to try to avoid that because, like I said, down the road, if somebody needs to take this apart, they don't want to pull that rack and pinion out of there unless they have to, and that's where that is. In the back, where the oil pan is going to meet or come close to the cross member, there's 3/8 of an inch or so of clearance, which is fine. But if you go to lower the back of the engine very much to try to make room, then that oil pan can interact with the cross member. So I want to try to avoid that. In the back here, you know, I talked about in the last video how I made a bigger hole in that tranny brace, or the cross member brace that runs side to side, for the air vent cap that's up on top. So whenever you're thinking about putting this in, you have to consider how that's going to interact as well, because you know what, some ideas were to tilt everything down and work it up in, and so I think that would be a conflict. Now, of course, in the back here, I can take off all this bracing that's part of the TCI kit. That's not really a big deal. On the other side of things, that engine has to come straight down. I know it was suggested as well to try to put the thing together and bring it in and angle it and all that sort of thing, but with that oil pan and stuff being in the way, it's just not going to work. Another suggestion was to remove the engine mounts and just lower everything down into place without you know, the mounts in place, and then lift it up and reattach the mounts, which could work, but again, you're limited by this travel area. You know, I'm trying to think of ways to make it as convenient as possible for the end user, you know, when it comes down to maintenance and that sort of thing. The other things suggested were, of course, cutting the firewall. And I have some more information that I think is going to be beneficial. I'm going to show you from up above when I get up on top of the ladder. Here are some measurements that may help with all this. 1 5/8, that is the measurement from the front of the firewall to the mount lug on the transmission. 1 3/8 is the drop from this location on the transmission to the mating flange, or the back of the block. So now the bolts they provided with this kit are 2 3/16 inches long, and if I try to put one of those in, I can't. There's just not enough angle. You know, I hit the bottom of the firewall in that transition area, so that won't work. If I take an 1.5 inch bolt and I feed that in, it'll go in, and you see you have about, I don't know, 1/8 of an inch maybe sticking out. And if I compare that to this 2 3/16 bolt, you can see, hopefully see, if I can get it to sit still, I'm going to get the light, here we go. You can see how deep that is in the block. That's a lot of material into the block. Now, I've looked up some requirements for grip length, and this is probably close to the max for length that you would need on this. So I'm going to show you some more information on that, and I'm going to try some different things to see if I can make something work without modifying anything but the bolts. Don't mind my crude representation of the engine and transmission. Basically what I wanted to show was, you know, with the engine, it has to come straight down to fit over the cross member, and like I said, if you try to tilt it, it's going to hit things on the way in. The transmission comes in second, and again, the point being, you know, if you have a couple bolts here and you try to tilt the assembly, that it'll try to bind, you know, on various things as it gets moved around. Now, like I said, the one suggestion was to remove the engine mounts, which, you know, in theory you could bring the engine down a little bit and that might give you enough clearance. But down the road, again, somebody wants to take this apart, they're going to have to do the same thing. And that gets kind of, you know, cumbersome. The floor pan fits really, really close to the transmission. So I've tried to lift this up, and I'm limited, you know, in the back hits where that cross member is, so that kind of limits the angles. I've also tried to lower it as an assembly, and again, the bolts that hold the motor mounts they can only pivot so far. Now, it was suggested I pull the bolts halfway out, but the flanges are so tight on the motor mounts or engine mounts that they would still bind. It would still cause a problem. You know, one of the ideas, of course, was to cut the firewall and make a relief, and that's kind of an option as well. But I'm going to experiment a little bit differently. Again, these are the bolts that came with the kit, and as I point out, they're 2 3/16 inches long. Well, doing the math, if I've got an 1 5/8, well, I need an 1 3/8 of length to, you know, cover the thickness of the transmission mount. Well, here, this might explain it a little bit better. From the firewall to the transmission, it's 1 5/8. The transmission mount is 1 3/8 thick. The bolts they give me 7/16 by 1/4 national course by 2 3/16 grip length. The minimum thread engagement, and I'll show an example of this. I have a picture that I took off the internet. Minimum thread engagement is 0.31 inches for a bolt with a 7/16 inch diameter. There's another reference in there that says a rule of thumb kind of thing where it's supposed to be 2 times the diameter. So that would make that 7/8 of an inch in length, that's an awful lot of material. Now, what I see is if I go by well, in this case, I've drawn this out. So what I've done is I've put a mark on the bolt at 1 3/8. And then if I add in 0.31, I don't know if you can see that, if I add in 0.31 for the additional length, then what should be reasonable overall length is 1 3/4 minimum. So what I want to do is I'm going to start with this bolt that's 2 3/16. And I'm going to shorten it up. I'm going to come back to maybe 1 7/8 or 1 3/4, which should be well over that minimum length that's required for the bolt to have proper grip. And I think I may be able to get away with doing this and getting these bolts to work. And if they don't, well, then I'll go to plan B. But that's where I'm at right now. I'm going to shorten up one of these bolts and see if I can't get them in the holes. So I cut the bolts. I started with this one. I just went short. This is 1 11/16, which is less than the minimum that I want of 1 3/4, but I wanted to see if it would fit, and it does. So I cut one at 1 7/8 to see if I could get that in. No, this will not fit. And then I cut this one at 1 13/16, which is just over the 3/4 that I want, or 1 3/4 that I want for a length. Now what I did is I lowered the transmission on my little stand here. In fact, the stand's not even touching. So all of the weight is on the engine mounts, on the bolts. So everything is on the mounts and it's as low as I can get it. So let me get up on the ladder and show you this bolt. Hopefully you can see all this okay. It's kind of, tough being on the ladder, but anyway, with the engine, tilted down in the back, if I go to the far side, I can get that in just barely. But you can see how much thread I have to work with. That's making contact with the back of the block. So that's a good bit right there. It's probably close to at least 1/2 inch. And now I can get this bolt in on the passenger side, but I have to push down a little bit on the back of the block. And obviously I can't do that with 2 hands or one hand holding the camera. But if I push it down just a little bit, I can get that bolt in. And I think that's going to work out fine. If I put the bolt up on top And again, trying to look at what I'll end up with for a grip length. Oops. There's contact with the back of the transmission, and I've got, looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, at least 7 threads that will be biting into the block. Now I do realize there is an 1/8 inch plate that's going to go in there, and I don't plan on using a washer. This kit that they sent me, there were no washers provided for the 6 bolts that go into the back of the block, so I'm not going to use one. Now I may have to trim this down to actually 1 3/4 inches, because when I add that 1/8 inch plate, it's going to push the transmission back just a little bit, but I still feel like this is going to do the job. So I think that takes care of this problem that I have. So now I'm on to resolving the header problem. What I've done is I've bolted the header in place. So it's on the car as it should be, and you can see clearly it has, you know, clearance right here at the transmission. Of course the light's in the way there, but everything else is cleared. Suspension, all that stuff is fine. Now, in a previous video I talked about how the angle from the U-joint up there to the rack and pinion setup would interfere with, or the shaft would interfere with the header. What I found is, and this was after a suggestion from one of the viewers, that I could extend or push in that steering column as I mentioned earlier, and I've done that. I've taken it into the engine bay as much as I possibly can, and I'll show you more of that in just a second. But, and it's kind of hard to point at things, but essentially there was only about 1/4 inch of the original, or that shaft, sticking through the firewall. And as you can see now, I've got about probably 1 inch and about 1/4, I would guess, sticking through, and that's going to change the angle on the U-joint. Now I still am going to have interference problems, and I'm going to show you that in a minute, but this is going to help, and I'll just have to show you. Let me show you the top side of the steering column. Now when I first put the steering column in, I had brought up the flange here, let's say, to about this location, and to figure that out I had taken measurements from the other car, or what was left of the car that still has the steering column in it, and I don't remember what the measurements were, but I set this at about the same distance into the seating area. So when I did that, there was a good, you know, clearance there at the steering column where it meets the bottom of the dash. As you can see right now, it's not touching with this big collar, the tapered collar, but it's very close. The other thing that I had to do was the bracket that actually holds the column up to the bottom, that holds the column up to the bottom of the dash. It has a slot in the column, and there's a little tang or tab sticking out of that, and this is at the lowest possible setting that I could still bolt that in there. So just know that you can only go just so far, and clearance at the dash is going to be one issue, and then if you use the original bracket, that'll be the other issue. Otherwise, you know, I think it'll be fine. Now this is the shaft that goes from the U-joint coming out of the column to the U-joint on the Borgeson rack and pinion setup. And initially when I made this, I had made it long as I possibly could, and that's what these red marks are right here. And those indicate where it sits within the U-joint to have clearance on the inside so that it doesn't hit anything, but also give enough length to where it's deep enough in there. So those were the old marks, and that just showed again how much was revealed whenever the U-joint was in place. What I found is, since I moved the column down, I'm going to have to shorten it by basically that same amount. There's my mark of how much material I've taken away, or I'm going to have to take away in order to get this back into the U-joints. So I'm going to cut that off, and if I haven't said it before, I'm using this Bad Dog diamond wheel. Really liking this thing. They're not cheap, I'll tell you that, but they've got a lifetime guarantee, and I've cut many things with this so far, and I'm very happy with it. I know this is really hard to see, even for me it's hard to see, but if I put in the end of the shaft into the upper U-joint, I can get it towards the lower U-joint, and I'm going to try to get a better angle on that so you can see it. And I know this is challenging because I can't get my hands in the way, but if I line up the steering shaft to where this lower U-joint almost goes in, you can probably see that it's hitting the header. Now I know I said before I wasn't going to put a dent in these headers, but I think I'm obligated to put a dent in these headers. It's not going to take much, and I don't know what the alternative would really be besides putting in shorty headers, as Call of George has suggested. But, you know, if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. And I will attempt, see if I can get a better angle there. Maybe that helps. You just see it. It's not hitting much. And, man, I'm just going to have to make a dent. And I'll be very careful with that. Hopefully I don't damage the coating. If it does, well, we'll go back to square one. But at this point, I don't know what else to do. So I placed a mark. I traced the edge of that bar. That's the lower mark. So the thickness of the bar, there's a little tiny mark above that. I couldn't get a Sharpie in there to, draw a line. So at this point, that's my high and low area, and I will find a way to make a nice dent in this header. So here's what I've decided to do. I've got the two marks right here on the pipe that needs to be bent. So what I did is I had the first mark and a little bit of a witness, and then I just drew two more lines. So what I want to do is make sure I'm going to hit it in the right place. So the first thing I want to do is get some tape, and I'm going to lay this across that location to represent my strike area, let's say. So if I line that up, that's going to be where I want to lay whatever I'm going to use to hit, right? Now, at this point, I want to also reinforce or support the bottom of this pipe. So I can take, in this case, about 3 paint sticks and get it underneath the bent part of the pipe, and that lets me know that it's got some support. Now what I want to do is I'm going to take a cloth and lay right over the strike area. So the idea is, if I take this piece of pipe and I lay it exactly over and follow the tape line, pow, I can drive it down and hopefully create a clean dent. So I'm going to put some earmuffs on. I know it won't be that loud, but I'll do it anyway. Lay that in line. It's going to take more than that. I didn't want to drive into it. Just try it. Wow. That's some tough stuff. It didn't do anything. Let me go to another plan here. I wasn't sure if that piece of cloth was going to be a problem, but it may be a combination of things, because there's going to be some flex, obviously. Now it's doing a little bit. Yeah, it really didn't do much of a dent, but it may have repositioned this pipe just a little bit. I didn't pay that much attention to how much of a gap was right here, but there's not much at this point. It's not touching, but you know what? I'm going to do a test fit and see if that didn't help. So that's the only way you want to do this. Go back and forth, check it. You know how it is. So I did a test fit, and it really didn't do much. I did add a popsicle or a paint stick between these two tubes, and I switched out to a piece of OSB instead of cardboard to give a little more resistance. So I'm going to try this some more. You get the idea. I'll let you know how it looks when I'm done. I have the rod in, and if I come up from underneath, you can see there's looking straight up the side of the shaft, and there's the dent in the header. Now that dent is not big enough yet, I'll say that. And the reason I say that is I can rotate the column or the steering back and forth, and it gives me just not even 1/8 of an inch of clearance. And get this angle here, so it's still just a little too close. It's not touching, but it's going to need more clearance. So I have to get the upper half of the tube caved in more, and that may take care of it. All right. I got it. And I am now happy with that. You can see the clearance. I think that's going to be fine. There's about 1/4 inch of clearance around the shaft. Come back on this side, and let me see if I can get around that without the light in the way. Here's a better angle with the light out of the way. That, like I said, that's about 1/4 inch. I think that's going to clear just fine now. Obviously not something you want to have to do, but sometimes you just, have to bite the bullet and take care of things. So at this point, I'm not going to worry about the headers fitting anymore, and I can move on from there. Now let me show you, I'll take this back off and just show you what I used overall to make that dent. Sorry about the chainsaw noises. They're cutting trees across the street. Using that pipe, it was starting to work, but it wasn't doing enough. And I also realized that this little table that I'm on, this is a welding table, one of the portable ones, and I realized that it was absorbing some of the impact. So I moved over to my rigid steel table that I have, very thick 1/2 inch plate on top and steel legs, there's no giving on that. But I did the same thing. I used the pipe, got some movement, and then I moved up to, this was a 30 millimeter impact socket. And, I was smashing on that socket to get it to change shape, but it only did so much. It would not get it, deeper. So then I switched to a 3/4 inch socket on an extension and just wailed on it. I mean, I beat on this thing off and on for an hour, to get the shape where I wanted it. And I don't know that I could really go much deeper. If you look at it, it's, it's not like a sharp corner, but it's compressed enough that it doesn't want to give anymore. The nice part about this is you won't see this. This is looking down on the car. You can't see any of this. And then the shaft, of course, will cover up the rest of it. I don't see it being an issue. Initially, I said I don't want to do this, and I really didn't want to have to do this. But what are the alternatives? Adding that other U-joint, complicating the system. If I could get away with it with this, fine. So that's what I did, and as it turns out, it worked. Whew! All right, so that's going to be the end of this video. I don't want to do any more with the engine and transmission and headers and steering. I'm done with that for now. I will say that I still need the cross member for the transmission. They make a custom one. I think they sell it, I know they sell it through Summit. CJ Pony Parts sells it. And California Custom Pony Cars or something, I think is one who has a kit for all this stuff, but I haven't really researched that. I do know that the cross member is custom made, so I'll have to wait for that to come so I can make sure everything is going to fit. But I'm much happier now than I was last week with the last video. As you could tell by the end of that video, I was very frustrated. And I don't like to get that way. I like to resolve problems, take a step back and figure things out. And that's basically what I did with comments from viewers like you. As I said before, it was suggested to use studs. It was suggested to do motor mount changes, a variety of different things, tilting the engine, whatever. So using those thoughts and some of those ideas, I tried, some of that. And then, of course, I came to the conclusion that I can, shorten up those bolts, still have enough grip length, and be comfortable with the transmission bolted to the engine. Now, I still, there's still the plate that goes between the engine and transmission. I understand that. But I still feel like at this point I can get those bolts in and be happy with it. Now, the exhaust header, I said early on in that last video, I did not want to put a dent in that header. However, I saw no alternative. And, I used just various tools and just kind of beat it in submission. But everything clears now, and that's all that matters. I did have to shorten up the shaft from the steering column to the rack and pinion setup, and I also had to bring the steering column into the firewall or into the engine bay further, which shortened up the distance up at the top where the dash and the steering column interact. Hopefully that doesn't cause any problems. If it does, then I'm backtracking and starting over again. But at this point, I'm happy with the way it's working, and I've cycled the steering back and forth. It's all smooth, and 2 thumbs up for that. So anyway, I don't know what the next video is going to be. I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do on this particular car. I do know that there's still obviously a lot of stuff to do. With my current situation, and I know with everybody out there with this coronavirus or COVID-19 as it's officially called, that people aren't working or unable to go to work or locked, have quarantine, locked up, whatever. Same situation for me. My regular job, I work weekend shift, and I work Friday, Saturday, Sundays basically, and every third Thursday I go in for another shift. Well, they have decided to reduce our hours, so instead of 40 hours a week, we are now going to work 30 hours a week. Not a great thing, but I still have a job, and I can still get paid even though it'll be basically 25% less than what I'm making now. So, you know, it's hard to stay motivated. It's hard to get fired up and want to do things whenever you're like, what's going to happen next? But, you know, take these opportunities, spend time with your family, spend time working on your project, you know, get stuff done, take care of yourselves. I hope to have another video out next week. I've got another, I know I have one for sure viewers project. I have a viewers project update that I can put out. And I have another viewers project that's going to take some editing. You know, it's got a variety of clips that were sent to me, so I'm going to have to kind of push those together and see if I can't work that out. But hopefully I can get more content out there for you. I also have a vehicle here that belongs to an old friend of mine, who is old, by the way. And it's I showed it in the video clip. It's a 65 Impala that he's owned for over 50 years. That's pretty amazing. So I'm going to try to do a video on that car. I know it's nothing special, but I just think it's cool, the fact that he's still using this car. So anyway, that's coming in the next week or two, whatever. And I do have work to do on that car, by the way. So that'll maybe I'll do a video on that. I don't know yet. But that's going to be it for this particular video. So I want to thank you for the support. I want to thank you for the comments left on the previous videos as far as suggestions and ideas, and you know, even links to various other items and content that helped with my decision to do what I did with this car. So very much appreciated, and hopefully you can find this information useful as well. That's going to be it. So subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Hit that like button if you haven't hit the like. You know, give a thumbs up. Hit the bell button or notification or whatever it is. And by all means, wash your hands. Take care of yourself. Take care of your families. And stay safe. We want to see you, and the rest of the world wants to see us all get back to work and make it a better place. So, see ya. Hey gang, welcome back to another video here at Joe Daddy's Garage. Now, if you're new to the channel, ascend or move forward the steering column. You can see that I've done some measuring. Whoops. And this bolt is 2 13/16 inches long. So the first thing I want to do is to get some tape. Well as I had hoped. I mean, it did some, made some changes. Chainsaws.